I had counted 23 winters by the morning of the claiming, and I had decided that none of the women in the long mirrored hall were as frightened as they pretended to be. I knew this because I was the one who was actually frightened, and I was not pretending at all. The veil they had given me was the colour of river fog at first light. It fell from a circlet of plain iron and reached past my collarbones, and it was thicker than the other veils, thick enough that the candle flames on the far wall were only smudges of gold through it. The other girls had been given gauze. I had been given weather. I had not asked who chose which veil for whom. I had assumed the housekeeper. The housekeeper, when I had passed her in the corridor, had not been able to meet my eyes, which should have been my first warning. My name is Morella, and I had spent 6 of those 23 winters as a healer's apprentice in the western wing of the king's fortress, which is a polite way of saying I had spent 6 winters being useful enough not to be sent away, and quiet enough not to be remembered. I was good at the work. I was good at being quiet. There was a reason for both. I touched the veil where it lay along my jaw, and I felt, through the cloth, the long pale ridge of the scar that ran from the corner of my mouth to the hinge of my ear. The other girls did not have scars. The other girls had spent the morning being oiled and braided and laughed over by their mothers. I had spent the morning trying to convince the steward that I did not have to be here at all. The steward had looked at me with a face like a closed door and said, "His Majesty's list, my lady. It is not for me to amend." I was not a lady. I was a healer's girl who slept above the herb stores and smelled, faintly and permanently, of crushed yarrow. The steward had bowed and said it was not for him to amend, and had pressed the iron circlet and the river fog veil into my hands as though they were a sentence. I had worn them. I had walked the long corridor down to the hall with the other 37 women, and I had taken my place at the end of the line because I assumed, sensibly, that the king would walk it from the front, and that by the time he reached me, he would already have chosen, and I could go home to the herb stores and the yarrow and never think of this again. I would like to record, for the benefit of anyone who has ever made a sensible assumption about an alpha king, that this is not how it went. The doors at the far end of the hall opened, and the court came in. I had seen the king before, of course. I had handed him a poultice once, for a hawk bite on the back of his hand, and he had said thank you in the voice of a man who used the word rarely enough that it sounded foreign in his mouth. I had not been wearing a veil then, and he had not looked at my face for longer than the exchange required, which I had thought was kindness. Now, looking down the long hall through river fog, I watched him enter and revised the assumption. Torvald, called the Iron, stood half a head taller than any man in his court, and he carried his height the way some men carry a sword, as something they would prefer not to draw. He wore black, and the wolf crown of the Iron Territories, a thin band of dark metal that catches no light, and which I had always thought looked too heavy for any human neck. He looked, that morning, as though it weighed exactly what it weighed. He did not look at the line of women yet. He looked at his beater, a broad, red-haired man called Asmund, and Asmund said something low. The king did not answer. He moved to the head of the hall, stood with his back to us, and waited. I should explain, before what happened happens, that the claiming ceremony of the Iron Territories is not romance. It is law. Once a generation, the Alpha walks the line of presented daughters and lays his hand at the throat of one of them, and that woman becomes Luna. The veils are tradition, meant to ensure that the Alpha chooses the wolf, not the face. In practice, every Alpha for the last 6 generations had already known whom he was going to choose before he set foot in the hall, and the veils had become theatre. I knew this because the housekeeper had told me, once, while I was helping her sort linens. She had said it with a small, bitter smile, the way old women say true things they have decided not to be angry about anymore. I had thought, walking down the corridor that morning, that the king would lift one veil and walk out with Lady Sigrid of Bron-Tor, who was 3 places ahead of me in the line, and who had been raised since she was a child to know which way her hair fell most flatteringly when a crown was set upon it. I thought a great many things that morning. I was about to be wrong about most of them. The king turned. He walked the line slowly. He did not lift any veil. He paused, twice. Once at a girl with copper braids, whose mother had bribed half the court, and once at Sigrid, whose chin came up as he stopped, and whose smile, through the gauze, was the kind of smile a knife wears when it is in the sheath. He did not lift her veil either. He walked past her. I heard a sound from the court, not a gasp, something more honest than a gasp, the small involuntary noise people make when something they paid to see is not happening. Sigrid's smile did not move. I noticed behind the gauze that her hand had closed on the embroidery at her waist, hard enough to whiten the knuckles. I noticed because I was watching her. I was watching her because I did not want to watch him. The king kept walking. He passed 2 more girls. He passed 3. The hall was so quiet I could hear his boots on the stone, and I could hear my own heart, which was being unhelpful, and I could hear the housekeeper somewhere behind a pillar inhale slowly through her nose. He stopped in front of me. I am, as a rule, a composed woman. I had not screamed when I was 7 and the wolfhound had taken half my face. I had not wept when my mother had sold me to the king's healer for the price of a winter's grain. I had handed a poultice to the most powerful man in the 7 territories without rattling the bowl. I considered composure my dowry. I lost it, briefly, when he stopped in front of me. I felt the front of the veil move with my breath. I felt the iron circlet bite into my hair. I felt the river fog colour of the cloth between us, and I thought, with a clarity I could not have summoned at any other moment of my life, that I had been given the thickest veil in the hall for a reason, and I had not been the one to choose it. He did not speak. He did not move for a long moment. I could see, through the cloth, only the dark blur of him and the darker line of the crown. Then, with hands that I had seen close around a sword pommel without effort and around a poultice without crushing it, he lifted the veil from my face. He did it slowly. He did it himself. He did not summon an attendant, which was the custom. The king names the chosen woman, and a steward lifts the cloth. He lifted it. The hall, behind him, made the second involuntary sound of the morning, and this one was louder. I had not been seen, without the veil, by anyone in this hall except the housekeeper and the king himself, and that king had only looked at the back of my hand. I felt, as the cloth left my hair, like a candle that had been carried into a room, expecting only to light the corner, and had been set in the centre of the table instead. I looked up at him, because I had decided, somewhere between his 2nd step and his 3rd, that I would not look at the floor. If he was going to do this, I was going to make him look at the thing he was doing. His eyes were the colour of weathered iron. I had not been close enough to know that before. The scar at my mouth pulled when I lifted my chin, which it always did, and his gaze moved across it, once without lingering, without pity, and returned to my eyes. He said, low enough that only I should have heard it, "Hello, Morella." He had never used my name before. I had not realised he knew it. I did not say hello back. I said, because someone had to break the silence, and I was apparently the only one in the hall capable. Your Majesty has made a mistake. The court, behind him, made the third involuntary sound of the morning. His mouth. I had never paid attention to his mouth, and I will not begin now, except to record that it moved very slightly at the corner, twitched, and did not smile, and did not quite stop trying to. No, he said, I have not. He laid his hand at the side of my throat. He did not press. He did not grip. He set his palm there, the way one sets a sealed letter on a table. Deliberately, as if the gesture had been chosen long before the moment of doing it. And he turned his head to the court and said, in the voice that ran the Iron Territories, "This one, by name, Mirella of the Western Wing. Witness it." The hall did not applaud. The hall did not breathe. Sigrid of Bron-Tor took one step forward and then thought better of it. I saw the step. I filed it. The king's hand left my throat. He offered me his arm. I had a brief, fierce, ridiculous moment of considering refusing it, just to find out what he would do. And I decided that I would save that for another day, because I was going to need many other days for the things I was now going to need to find out. I laid my hand on his sleeve. The wool was warm from him. I did not think about that. He walked me out of the hall, and I did not look back at Sigrid, because I knew, the way you know the weather is going to turn before the wind shifts, that I was going to have to look at her plenty before this was over. If you have followed me this far, stay with me. What comes next is the part of the morning I have spent the most nights trying to understand. The court will appear in a moment, and the books, and the mirror. If her voice is one you want to keep walking with, leave a small mark on this page so the next listener finds it more easily. We are not yet at the part where I begin to understand him. We are only at the part where I begin to suspect that he, somehow, had been understanding me. He took me to the library. I had expected to be taken to a chamber where attendants would change me out of the linen ceremonial robe and into something with more silver thread, and where Lady Asmund, the beater's wife, would explain to me which fork was for which fish. The king took me to the library. He took me past the chamber and past Lady Asmund, who looked at us with her mouth open, and he took me through a door I had walked past 100 times and had not, in 6 winters, been invited to open. He shut the door behind us. He did not bar it. I noted that he did not bar it. He stood with his back to it, and he looked at me as though he was finally permitted to, and he said, "You will want to ask me questions. Ask." I am told that healers' apprentices, when given permission by a king to ask any question they like, ought to ask politic ones. Mine were not. Why was my veil thicker than the others? He drew a slow breath. He said, "Because I asked the housekeeper to send you the thickest one in the chest, so that you could change your mind on the walk down and turn back, and I would not see your face refuse me in front of the court." I considered this. I said, "Did you choose the veil before or after you decided to walk past Lady Sigrid?" His mouth did the thing again. Before. How long before? 6 winters, he said. I had been a healer's apprentice in the western wing of his fortress for 6 winters. I sat down. There was a chair. I am grateful, in retrospect, that there was a chair. I sat in it, and I looked at him, and I said, "Explain." He explained. The first time he had seen me had not been the morning of the poultice. The first time he had seen me had been the morning my mother brought me to the fortress, 15 winters old, and bandaged across half my face. and he had been 21 and 3 months into a crown he had not wanted, and he had stood at a window in the upper gallery and watched me refuse to cry, while the steward haggled my price down with the healer. He had paid the rest of the price himself, out of his own coin, and had instructed the healer never to mention it. He had spent the next 6 winters, he said, making sure I was fed and warm, and never sent anywhere I did not wish to go, and had instructed the housekeeper that under no circumstances was I to be put in his path. He had been a man with a crown who saw a girl with a wound, and he was not going to be the kind of king his father had been. He had written my name on the claiming list himself 3 months ago, when his council had presented him with 37 daughters of noble blood and demanded he choose one. He had crossed it off twice and added it back 3 times. The last time he added it, he said, he had stopped pretending he did not know what he was doing. He had given the housekeeper the thickest veil in the chest because he wanted me to have one last way out, and he had been prepared to walk past me if I had not been wearing it. I had been wearing it. He had not walked past me. I sat in the chair in the library, in a robe of unfamiliar linen, and I tried to assemble all of this into a shape my mind could carry. I was not, on the whole, succeeding. He said, "I owe you nothing of yours." I looked up. "Your face," he said, "your past, your time, your choosing. I have not earned any of it. My wolf decided what he decided 15 winters ago, and I have spent 15 winters trying not to let it cost you anything. If you wish to walk out of this room and never enter another, the door is not barred." I noticed, again, that the door was not barred. I said, "Why did you do it in front of the whole court?" He said, very quietly, "Because if I had done it in private, you would have spent the rest of your life wondering whether I was ashamed of you. I would rather the court hate me than have you wonder." I have been told, by women who have been in love and have admitted it cleanly, that there is a particular silence one falls into after a thing one cannot answer has been said. I did not know about that silence before. I learned it then. He did not press. He waited. The library was very warm and smelled of old parchment and the resin of the firewood he favoured, and I noticed that there were 6 books on the small table at his elbow, and all of them had ribbons in them, and 3 of the ribbons were river, fog, grey. I said, "What are the books?" He turned, slowly, as though he had hoped I would not ask. He picked up the topmost one. He said, "Healers' compendiums, from the southern abbeys, the northern ones, the ones in the old tongue I cannot read." "For me?" "For you," he said. "I did not know how to give them to you without explaining why." I stood up. My knees, I will record, were doing something I did not approve of. But I stood up. I crossed the rug. I picked up the topmost book. It was thicker than my veil had been. I held it for a long moment, and I did not look at him. "Torvald," I said. I had never used his name. I felt him register it, the way a hearth fire registers a window opening across the room. "You have made one error," I said. I felt him brace. "The veil," I said, "was a kindness. The books were a kindness. The list, twice crossed and 3 times restored, was a kindness. You have spent 15 winters being kind to me without telling me, and I am going to have to insist, going forward, that you tell me." He let out a breath I do not think he had known he was holding. He said, "I can do that." I had been about to say something else, something dry, something composed, something to give myself back to myself, when the library door opened without a knock, and Asmund, the red-haired beater, came in with a face like ash and said, "Sire, Lady Sigrid has gone to the council. There is going to be a problem about the law." The law, it turned out, was one I had not known about. It had been written by the last Luna of the Iron Territories, Torvald's mother, when she was dying, and it stated that no wolf bearing a visible disfigurement might be presented in the claiming, on the grounds that the Luna's face was the face of the pack. Lady Sigrid of Bron-Tor had read the law aloud in front of the council within the hour, and had requested, with elaborate sorrow, that the claiming be voided and another walk of the hall conducted. She had not, anywhere in her speech, used the word scar, which made it more vicious than if she had. Torvald, when Asmund finished telling us, did not move for a long moment. Then he set the topmost book down on the table, very carefully, and he said, "I am going to break my mother's law." I said, "Tell me what it costs you." He looked at me. "The protection of her name. Every decision I have made for 15 winters that was contested in council, I have settled by invoking what she wrote. If I break this, I lose the rest. They will come back at me, every one of them." I said, "Then do not break it." He looked at me, and for the first time that morning, his composure did the thing I had been waiting for it to do. Slipped, just at the corner of his mouth, just behind his eyes, where I could see it and the rest of the world could not. He said, "Mirella." I said, "Find another way. There is always another way. Send for the law. I want to read it." He sent for the law. While we waited, Asmund stood by the door with the expression of a man who had walked into one disaster and encountered another. And Torvald sat across from me in the second library chair, and I read his mother's handwriting in the firelight. The law forbade the presentation of a disfigured wolf at the claiming. It did not provide for the rescission of a claiming once a king had laid his hand at a throat and named the chosen woman in front of the witnessing court. Sigrid's argument was that the presentation had been unlawful from the start. My argument, and I read it twice to be sure, was that the law forbade the presenting, not the chosen. Once the king had chosen, the choice was the choice. To void it, the council would have to declare that the previous Luna's law overruled the current king's claim. They would be setting a dead Luna above a living Alpha. I looked up at him. "Your mother's law cannot reach me anymore." The claiming closed at the hand at the throat. They cannot pull me back through that gate without breaking a more important rule than the one Sigrid is invoking. He stared at me for a long moment. Then he laughed, quietly, only once under his breath, and he said, "I have had 3 jurists on this for an hour. You read it in 5 minutes. I have had longer to think about disfigurements than your jurists have." I had not meant the line to land the way it landed. He did not laugh again. He looked at me with something that was no longer composed at all. I drank water that someone had brought. We went down to the council. The council was 40 men and 3 women in a long hall lit by clerestory windows, and Sigrid of Bron-Tor stood at the centre of the floor in pale grey, and she was very beautiful, and her case was very well rehearsed. I let her finish. I had learned in 6 winters of being quiet that the most effective time to speak is after someone louder than you has run out of things to say. When she finished, she turned to Torvald with the small, triumphant softness of a woman who had remembered that the law she was invoking had been written by his mother, and that he had loved his mother. I stepped forward before he could speak. I said, "Lady Sigrid, may I see the law in your hand?" She blinked. She had expected him. She had not prepared for me. She handed me the parchment. I read it aloud, the whole of it, slowly, in the voice I had used for 6 winters to read the symptoms of dying men back to my mistress. I read the part Sigrid had read. I read the part Sigrid had not. The law forbids the presenting. The presenting closed when the king's hand left my throat. My lady, you are not asking the council to enforce a law. You are asking the council to invent one. The hall was silent. I handed the parchment back to her. I said, very gently, because gentleness is the cruelest thing a quiet woman can do. I am sorry for the trouble of your morning. The chest of veils is still in the long hall, if you would like one. She did not slap me. I had been ready for her to. She turned, slowly, the colour of riverbed clay, and walked out of the council hall. 3 of her father's allies walked out with her, and 4 did not. The 4 who did not, I noted, were the ones who had been watching the king's face while I spoke. Torvald stood up and said to the council, "The claiming stands. Morella of the Western Wing is Luna of the Iron Territories. Anyone who wishes to argue this with my mother's ghost may do so on their own time." The hall, for the 3rd time that morning, made a sound that was not quite a gasp. We went back to the library. He did not speak until the door was closed. Then he said, "She will not be done." I said, "I know." He said, "There will be a poisoning, or a paid blade, or a letter from a rival pack. She has 3 brothers who do not love being out of favour." I said, "I know." He looked at me. "You are very calm. I have been in this fortress for 6 winters, and the most dangerous thing I have ever had to do is bandage a stag bite for a beater who did not believe in willow bark. I am about to learn a new trade. I would prefer to learn it without flinching." He did not answer. He picked up the silver hand mirror from the table beside the books, a small thing, the size of my palm, with a back face of solid silver and no glass on the other side at all, and he held it out to me. I had not noticed it before. I took it, I turned it over. There was no glass. There was only a smooth disc of silver where a reflection should have been. I looked up at him. He said, "I had it made for you in the 2nd winter. When the healer told me you had begun refusing to use the polished pans, I thought, if you were going to refuse to look at yourself, I would at least make sure no one in your wing could hand you a reflection by accident. I never gave it to you. It seemed too much like a confession." The mirror was warm in my hand from his. I said, "Torvald." He said, "Yes." I said, "Kiss me." I had not intended to ask for that. I had intended, I think, to ask him something else. About Sigrid, about the council, about the 4 men who had stayed. But I had been holding the silver disc that had no glass in it, and I had been thinking about a man who had spent 15 winters making sure I did not have to look at myself. And the sentence that came out of my mouth was a different one. He crossed the rug. He stopped a careful pace away. He set his hand at the side of my throat where he had set it before, in the long hall, in front of the court, and this time it was not law. This time it was only him. He kissed me. I cannot describe it. I have tried, in the months since, and everything I have on a page about it is the wrong words. What I will say is this. I had spent 23 winters being a woman the world had decided to look away from, and in the space of one quiet morning, a man with a crown had decided, in front of his entire court, to look directly at me. And now, in a library that smelled of resin and parchment and a fire he had built himself, he was telling me without words that he had been looking the whole time. Something I had been carrying for 15 winters set itself down in me, and I did not pick it back up. When he drew back, he set his forehead against the side of my hair, where the veil had been, and he breathed out once, and he said my name. Only my name, the way one says a word one has been saving. And that was the end of the part of the morning I have spent the most nights trying to understand. 3 months later, by the law of the Iron Territories, I was crowned Luna in the long hall, beneath the wolf throne, in a dress the colour of river fog. Sigrid of Bron-Tor was not in attendance. Her father had been quietly stripped of his border holdings after a letter of his, a letter to a rival pack about the weakness of the new Luna, had been intercepted by Asmund, who had been waiting for it. Sigrid herself had been sent to a southern abbey to study, the council had said, the law. I imagined she was finding the law difficult. The 4 men who had stayed when she walked out of the council had become my council. 3 of them were older than my mother had been when she sold me. One of them, on the morning of the crowning, walked the length of the long hall with a small chest in his hands and laid it at my feet and said, "From the chest of veils, my lady. I thought you might like to choose this time." I chose the thinnest one. Torvald, when I came into the hall, was already turning. He had not, this time, made me walk to him. He had walked halfway down the line of no one to meet me. His court, my court, was watching, and he did not, this time, lift the veil himself. He waited for me to. I lifted it. I will record, for the benefit of anyone who has ever wondered whether a king can be made to laugh in public, that the king of the Iron Territories laughed. Quietly, only once, low in his chest, when I lifted my own veil in front of his entire court. The court did not gasp this time. The court applauded. In the library that night, after the wine and the music and the long table where the 4 old men of my council had drunk to my health with the seriousness usually reserved for funerals, Torvald set the silver disc down on the table between us, the one with no glass. He said, "Do you want me to have a mirror made?" I picked it up. I turned it over. I looked at the smooth, blind, silver face of it, and I thought about 15 winters of being looked at by the only person whose looking I had ever wanted. And I set it back down. "No," I said. "I have one." He smiled, properly this time, all the way, and outside the window the wolves of the Iron Territories were calling to each other across the snow. And I was 23 winters old, and I had been recognised, and I was going to spend the rest of my life being looked at without flinching. Tell me, did you see it coming? The moment with the veil? Or was it the mirror, or the list, or the 4 old men that gave it away? I would like to know which part stayed with you. Stay a while in the comments. Leave a small mark on this page so the next listener finds her way to it. And if her voice is one you would like to keep walking with, you know where to find more of her. Until then, keep warm. There is weather coming. She thought the thick veil was the housekeeper's mistake. She thought the king would choose Lady Sigrid. She thought she would walk home to the herb stores and never think of this morning again. She was wrong about every part of it. And the part she was most wrong about was not the veil, or the king, or the choice he was about to make in front of his entire court. It was the 6 books on the table in the library, and the list with her name added back 3 times, and the silver hand mirror with no glass in it that he had been keeping in a locked drawer for 2 winters. The claiming ceremony of the Iron Territories had not, in 6 generations, gone the way it went the morning Torvald the Iron walked past Lady Sigrid of Bron-Tor and stopped in front of a healer's apprentice in a river fog vale. Pack law was about to break. The old Luna's ghost was about to be invoked. A woman who had not been looked at in 15 winters was about to discover she had been looked at the entire time. This is her side of the morning. the part she has spent the most nights trying to understand. If you stay until the council scene, you will hear the sentence she said to Lady Sigrid that emptied the hall. If you stay until the library, you will hear what he had been hiding for 6 of those winters, and why. If you stay until the end, the silver disc with no glass means something different than it did at the start.